Thanks, Radhika. Our next grand keynote is by well-known Silicon Valley VC, none other than Mr. Vinod Khosla. Moderating this session will be Ms. Lisa Lambert. Mr. Vinod Khosla is an entrepreneur, investor, and technology fan. He is the founder of Khosla Ventures, focused on impactful technology investments in software, AI, robotics, 3D printing, healthcare, and more. Mr. Khosla was a co-founder of Daisy Systems and the founding CEO of Sun Micro. One of Mr. Khosla's greatest passions is being a mentor to entrepreneurs, assisting entrepreneurs, and helping them build technology-based businesses. Mr. Khosla is driven by the desire to make a positive impact using technology to reinvent societal infrastructure and multiply resources. He's also passionate about social entrepreneurship. Vinod holds a Bachelor of Technology in Electrical Engineering from IIT, New Delhi, a Master's in Biomedical Engineering from Carnegie Mellon University, and an MBA from the Stanford Graduate School of Business. Ms. Lisa Lambert is the Chief Technology Officer at National Grid and also the founder president of National Grid Partners. She is responsible for leading investments and innovation initiatives across the company. Ms. Lambert has had senior and executive roles at the Wesley Group, a clean tech private venture capital firm, and at Intel, where she was the vice president and managing director of Intel Capital's Software Services Fund, and also managed a $125 million Intel Capital Diversity Fund. Ms. Lambert led global investments in over 100 companies at Intel Capital, and including 7 IPOs and over 35 M&A exits. She's also the board of directors for the National Venture Capital Association and the founder of Upward, a global network of executive women. Ms. Lambert earned an MBA from Harvard Business School and a BS in Management Information Systems from Penn State. One of the fun facts of Ms. Lambert is she played basketball on a scholarship at Penn State. So it's all slam dunk. Over to you, Lisa, for the session with Mr. Vinod.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's an honor for me to be here today at TiEcon 2020. I thought I'd cover a little housekeeping before we start. So first, we've got 45 minutes with Vinod. I'm going to ask some questions, but there is a way for you to ask questions and participate. So please do submit questions online, and I will pull those out as appropriate throughout the session. And then I know Vinod has a wealth of wisdoms. We thought we'd leave the last few minutes for him to just provide some closing remarks. And so we'll make room for that at the end. All right, well, Vinod, it is such an honor to be here with you. Given that we're here in Silicon Valley in the year 2020, and we're doing TiEcon on Zoom because of a global health pandemic, I thought it was appropriate for us to start with healthcare. And I know you're really passionate about healthcare, particularly healthcare and artificial intelligence and how it's applied to healthcare. There is a great expert named Eric Brynjolfsson who made a quote in 2017 saying that artificial intelligence won't replace managers, but managers who use AI will replace managers that don't. He also believes that there's going to be disparities between health systems and organizations that use AI and those that don't. And so I know you've got lots of thoughts about this, Vinod, whether it's genomics or predictive disease or symptomatic-based medicine. I wanted to get your comments on why you think this is going to become a reality in the next 3 years.
Yeah, so there's 2 levels at which we should look at this question. My interest in healthcare started from 2 aspects. One, I was looking at nonprofit healthcare efforts in India. Public health has largely been ignored, or was 15 years ago in India. There really were no institutions for public health. And I was looking at the simple question, what would it take to get the population doctor ratio, that means doctors per million population, to the same ratio in India as it is in the West, as it is in the US. And turns out in a 30-year period, no amount of money, if you had infinite resources, could get you to that level of care. You couldn't start enough medical schools, you couldn't train enough professors, to teach the students. You couldn't graduate enough students to fix the ratio, which was a good thing because it says you have to have something other than brute force solutions. So that was sort of my India aspect. My wife was working in education, nonprofit education. I was looking at nonprofit healthcare. My wife runs ck12.org. And I realized that we needed something better for people who had no other care, not people who had a Stanford physician to be available to them, but somebody who had no health care. It was a day's bus journey from the village to go travel, find a doctor. And I started looking at AI. At the same time, I was skiing and tore my ACL here in Utah in the day before Christmas. So I had 2 weeks of skiing planned and now 2 weeks of bed rest. I did an MRI, took it to 3 different physicians in Park City, which is the headquarters of the US ski team. So they have the best surgeons, and all 3 gave me different recommendations. It was very clear, even in the best healthcare system in the world, healthcare is very inconsistent. And they weren't learning from each other. Each had their view based on their personal experience. And while the Institute of Medicine talks about healthcare, a learning system, there is no learning in our healthcare system. People don't learn from the experience of everybody's patients. They learn from their patients and develop their own biases. Net result, I started looking for nonlinear solutions, and it was in 2011, December, while with a torn ACL, that I wrote my first blog called Do We Need Doctors? It was very, very clear then to me that AI was going to be the big leverage solution. Back to Eric's quote, the question's very simple. When I talk about will AI replace doctors, most expertise in 25 years will be embodied in AI that will assist humans who do the human element of care. In India, typically, you might get 30 seconds or 60 seconds with a doctor, especially if you're not paying a lot. They basically have judged your disease before they see you based on 1 or 2 symptoms. That's the typical experience. Mm-hmm. So dramatically improving that experience there and improving consistency of healthcare by assisting physicians is probably the right model for the next 20 years, 25 years. Excuse me. So that's where I think Eric's quote is right. For the next 25 years, we will see this paradigm of people who use AI to assist them will have higher quality care, make fewer errors, and provide more optimal treatment. But over the long term, I think scaling medicine will be done through AI. But that's a 25-year vision.
Well, that's fabulous. And I agree with you 100%. I think AI can also help reduce inequities and fix these biases in care that you talked about. You know, if humans are biased, and so AI can help expose that. Can you talk to us a little bit about what Khosla Ventures is doing with healthcare AI startups? One of the guests asked this question from the audience.
So things we don't do, let me start with that. We don't do traditional healthcare investing. We do invest, so we don't do healthcare IT, for example, at all. You know, it's just better billing options, better ways to charge Medicare more, just not our thing. We invest in the things that dramatically improve care for the patient, but also have a few other characteristics that other healthcare investors are not as good at. There are many healthcare investors that know a lot more about healthcare than we do, and they frankly do a much better job in traditional healthcare. But if AI is involved, if physics is involved, if intersectional things are involved across many disciplines, a lot of computing. That's when we actually add something to a venture and want to play a larger role. So AI-based drug discovery, we will do. Traditional drug discovery, there's other people who know how to do it much, much better than we can.
Very good.
But having said that, that's true across every area. We do healthcare diagnostics, we do AI-based drug discovery, we do new devices, procedures, new kinds of cell therapies. If you 3D printing artificial organs, that's not for a healthcare investor because it's laser interferometry. Yes, there's a stem cell differentiation aspect of it, but there's so much physics and AI learning involved in some of these areas. I'll give you an unusual example. Somebody's designing a retina. Now, retina cells can be grown, but every cell has to be great. So they use laser scanning and AI to judge cells that are not growing well in a retina layer before it can be implanted in a human. Use AI to do that, use physics to zap it, very much like they do in the semiconductor LCD business, display business. Combining those technologies is a really good fit for us across almost all areas of healthcare. But of course, if it's true AI, we are really deep into it and feel like we understand it better than most healthcare investors. So my son has a company to build a primary care AI doctor. The next 5 years, it's assisting doctors do better diagnosis and reduce the cost of a session. That's a pretty typical kind of thing. Or teaching a technician how to do a cardiac MRI exam by replacing by using self-driving expertise to replace the driver of the MRI machine, dramatically reduces the cost and speeds up MRI. So a wide range of things.
That's fabulous. One of the other guests for the event has asked a question around entrepreneurs and what they can do around emotional wellness. Do you have a view of that?
Yes, there's a lot to be done in this area at many, many levels. You know, we have a good company called Ginger.io that does mental health services directly for patients. And it sells to employers for their employees. It would sell to Intel for Intel employees. It's very, very low cost. What's stunning about it is when you take a traditional healthcare service that an Intel might sign up for its employees as a self-insured employer, usage of mental health services will be about, say from Magma, will be 1% of employees use it. When you have it available on your phone, interactively through chat and possibly telehealth, usage goes up to 10%. So what it's saying to me in mental health is there's a lot more people want the service. It's way too inaccessible, and technology can make it accessible. Another example in mental health is, and I'll give you my favorite example last, is a device in Sweden called Flow Neuroscience. That is the TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, done at home by the patient itself at home instead of taking drugs or instead of doing TMS in a clinic. Dramatically reduces cost, increases the number of sessions. It's a depression treatment, and you can avoid drugs with all its side effects. But my favorite one is the new one we are doing, replacing fMRI and MEG, which is the way the brain is studied in clinical research labs today. Increase the amount of data 1,000-fold so we can much better understand the brain. If you can fundamentally get 1,000-fold more data at 1/100th the price, you're going to see an explosion of treatments that are far better with far fewer side effects, which is a major problem in mental health. So we're pretty excited about that. But the other end of it, any consumer can sign up for a service called replica.ai. It's a free service and you can upgrade to a subscription service. And it's 100% AI-driven chat to make you feel better. It's a wellness app. It's not a clinical app, but the results are amazing and anybody in the audience can sign up. I love that because it's totally scalable because it's 100% driven by AI. And for a fraction of what your copay is, you can do 30 sessions instead of one with your psychiatrist.
Amazing. Amazing. There's one more question that I'll take here on healthcare from the audience. They wanted you to provide your insights on the use of machine learning and wearable devices to forecast seizures or strokes or other traumatic disease. Do you have a view?
Somebody, okay. Absolutely. Brain patterns can be predictive and they can be done. So absolutely seizures can be predicted. That was done in the 90s by a company called NeuroPace. Then they went on to not only detect seizures, but implant a device in your brain that would change the trajectory of the seizure. It would monitor your brain if a seizure was coming on. I was at Kleiner when we invested in that company. It would actually stimulate your brain to avoid the seizure. Now, of course, that's a very invasive procedure only for the most serious cases, but epilepsy is a very serious problem. There's a similar kind of device that monitors signals at your wrist in a company in Boston. I'm forgetting the name of the company that actually handles epilepsy through electromagnetic monitoring of your signals, your galvanic skin response, and your other signals at your wrist and can predict seizures. Very, very valuable approach to epilepsy.
All right, excellent. And then one last question, AR and VR in mental health. Is there a role for AR and VR? Do you see any interesting companies doing that?
There are companies attempting it. What I would say is it's early for AR, VR. Any way to stimulate the brain should allow us to intervene. And AR, VR is another mechanism. Even direct light therapy into the brain is called gamma light therapy. They induce LEDs with gamma wave frequency directly into the scalp to activate what are called microglial cells in the brain, a type of neuron in the brain. So TMS stimulates microglia, transcranial stimulation, gamma light therapy can stimulate it, AR, VR can stimulate it. The problem is we need lots of data to say what exact intervention will improve things and what will make things worse. We don't yet have enough data with AR, VR to answer that question, but it's a distinct possibility. I like lighter weight therapies like TMS at home. This gamma light therapy is very, very promising. There's a good book called The Angel and the Assassin and a book called The Inflamed Mind. I highly recommend people interested in this to read both.
Excellent.
But I'm not an expert in mental health.
Well, there's lots of questions around it, so I'm glad you had some perspective on it. When I think about healthcare, right, it's a high failure business. And when you think about venture capital, of course, it's a high failure business. And I've heard you say that your willingness to fail has allowed you to succeed. And you're not being embarrassed with your large failures have given you the courage to keep going. Can you talk to us about that? Why failure is such an important part of entrepreneurship and venture capital, and maybe give some folks some encouragement in this area.
So here's where I would go. You started by saying we are in Silicon Valley. To me, Silicon Valley is not a place, it's a culture. It's a culture of risk-taking. When somebody says it can't be done, you don't accept it, you ask, why can't it be done? How might you attempt it? It's a culture that says, I don't have to figure everything out to go after the problem. We just invested in a spin-off we helped create out of MIT Plasma Fusion Lab in fusion. Now, every expert says it's 50 years away. We think it's 5 years away. Putting the right team together and saying, why can't it be done? Is there nonlinear factors that might change the equation? So give good example in plasma fusion, the size of the fusion reactor depends on the magnetic field to the power of 4. So if you 5x the size of the magnetic field, and that can be done with room temperature or high temperature superconductors. If you 5x the strength of the magnets, then your device becomes 600 times smaller. Think about it. So can you take nonlinear approaches and avoid 50-year projects and make them 5-year projects? You ask how it can be, not why it can't be done. Here's a stunning fact. And this is why I say Silicon Valley is a culture. You have entrepreneurs who are willing to do this, technologists who are willing to do this. You have investors who are willing to back you, and you have senior executives who will give up their careers in big companies. In fact, it's a place where too long in too big a company is considered bad for your career, not good for your career. So if you're a big VP at a big company like GE, nobody wants to hire you in Silicon Valley. It's this culture of the whole ecosystem. Everybody is supportive of attempting things that are hard. It's why no large innovation, and this is stunning, large innovation has come from any large company in the last 40 years that I could find, not one. You know, Intel can go from 16 micron process to a 9 micron process, a 16 nanometer process to a 9 nanometer process down to 5. Those are incremental innovations. Radical innovations only come from entrepreneurs. And that's why I'm so passionate about entrepreneurship and this cultural attitude that I call the Silicon Valley culture, which can be replicated in any part of the world. So here's the surprising fact. Did General Motors or Volkswagen innovate in cars? No, it was Tesla and Waymo, two teams that knew nothing about cars. Did Airbus and Lockheed do space? No, it was companies like SpaceX and Rocket Labs. Did Walmart and Target innovate retail? No, it was Amazon. Did pharma companies do biotechnology? No, it was Genentech, and that was in the 70s. Did any of the media companies innovate in media? No, it was Twitter and Facebook and YouTube that didn't even know they were in the media business when they started. No large innovation that I can think of has come from either large companies who are in the space or from real experts in the space. Because a real expert knows why things can't be done. Their experience becomes a bias, a negative bias. New entrepreneurs reinvent things, rethink things because they don't know the space. So instead of inventing things, they ask a lot of questions. And that is really exciting. And that's why entrepreneurship is the most powerful tool society has to solve the world's problems. Did I answer your question?
That's perfect. Yes, that is great. This disruptive innovation, insurgents coming in to establish markets and reinventing them and disrupting the incumbents, the complacent large corporations, which are focused on profits and the biggest customers. I think that's a brilliant idea. Something we
Yeah,
believe
could
in.
Hilton ever rethink hotels like Airbnb did? Could
Precisely.
anybody in the transportation business do an Uber? No, it's just not possible. There are no examples of it.
But isn't there a stigma, though, even here in Silicon Valley, against failure? I mean, people don't go around talking about how many times they fail. When I did a Google search on you, I couldn't find failures. All I found was one success after another, after another, after another. But you believe that you'd rather try and fail than fail to try. So how do we get past the stigma of experimentation and failure and do that aggressively?
Well, I think fundamentally there's two kinds of people. People who are driven by what others think about them, and people who are internally driven. I've always been internally driven, and I don't mind attempting large things and talking about my failures because I always learn. The best learning I've always had is from failures. And I would say, even in your large audience, I suspect there's not a single person who's failed more times at more things than I have. Not one in your audience. And I always ask an audience a simple question. You can ask this on chat. Does anybody know the first startup, the second startup I did the same time I started Sun Microsystems? Not Daisy Systems, because that was pretty successful. But after I left, Scott McNeely and I started Sun and another company. And not one person can usually remember that failure. So I always say failures don't matter. People forget about them. And it doesn't matter. You're trying things. For all of you who haven't tried things because you're afraid it won't work, you failed before you started. You failed with 100% probability because you didn't try it. If I have a 10 or 20% chance of succeeding because I tried it, I have a much better chance at success. And that's why I say my willingness to fail gives me the ability to succeed. I've tried a lot of things. I've failed at a lot of things. I've learned a lot. And occasionally I succeed. And people then remember that, and that's all the stories they tell. You know, nobody remembers. I started, and so Scott McNeely and I started a month or two before Sun, a company called The Data Dump in San Jose. But nobody remembers that. It's interesting because with history, it doesn't get brought up. It should be on the Wikipedia page or something.
What is an acceptable amount of risk for entrepreneurs to take? Right? I mean, you're risk on, you're challenge the status quo, you're go after the incumbents. What's acceptable risk?
So it depends on the personal situation, right? And there's always nuance around failure. There are smart failures and dumb failures. There's smart attempts and dumb attempts. And I've written about it a little bit. My son recently wrote a blog people can look up called the failureship bias. So in a company, if you're an entrepreneur, no matter whether you have 500,000 in the bank or 50 million or 500 million, take 2, 3, 4, 5% of your market cap, or 10% of your cash, and run experiments with it and try lots of things with it. If they fail, they have the following characteristic. You lose 1 times your money. So let's say you have 500,000 in the bank. You take $50,000 and run 5 experiments that are $10,000 each. And if you're a large company and you have 500 million in the bank, run 5 experiments that are $10 million each. But they have to have the following characteristic. If you fail, you lose $10,000 or $10 million. It doesn't really matter. It's relative to your market cap, 0.5% to 1% of your market cap. Spend it on things that you can afford to lose. But if you win, they double your market cap. So asymmetric risk return is what matters, really. And that's what venture capital is about. But even within a startup, that's a good way to think of your risk. Do 5 things that are 0.5% to 1%. If it's failing, cut it quickly. Don't make it a program or a project. Just make it a 1-year attack. This was what Square Cash was at Square. It was just this side thing nobody paid attention to. It took a few $1 million a year to get started, probably accounts for 1/3 or 1/2, probably accounts for 10 billion of their market cap today. And that's a good example of attempting new things in a balanced way where the failure doesn't kill you. It may hurt a little bit, you lose some money, but it doesn't kill you. But if it works, it dramatically improves your outcome. And over the course of 5 years, you're likely to see things that double or triple your market cap easily over what it would have been. The same is true of personal risks. You know, if you have 4 kids going to college, there's risks you can't take. You can't risk being thrown out of your whole house because you can't give up, you can't pay your mortgage. But you can prepare your lifestyle to allow for more risk. In some sense, when you're younger and have fewer responsibilities, it's easier to do. But frankly, it's possible at every stage. If your kids have moved out of the house, you can again take a lot of risks if you're older. I do think failure is nuanced, and the right kind of failure can really help both careers and companies.
I like that. There are a couple audience questions that take us on a little bit of a different direction. One is, what do you think about inequity and the skilling gap in the world right now? So how can Silicon Valley and the technology world help make things better for everyone, not perceived select few? Do you have a view on that?
Yes. First, I think we have great inequity. And what's sad is it's going to get worse if technologies make a lot of progress. 5 years ago, I wrote a blog in Forbes magazine called AI Will Cause Great Abundance, Great Productivity Growth, Great GDP Growth, and Rising Inequality. That was 5 years ago. And I postulated 5 years ago that we would, if AI does everything we hope it can do for society and humanity, need universal basic income. We have, beyond inequality, because capitalism increases inequality, and since capitalism is by permission of democracy, by democratic voters, we can't take capitalism for granted. We have to modify it, not abandon it, but modify it to dramatically bias the playing field towards the have-nots, people who've been left behind. But let me go a bit further, given the Black Lives Movement, which I really support. We have much more racism than we realize. And I'd recommend people read a book I just finished reading called Anti-Racist. And it argues that most of us don't think we are racist, but in fact, we are racist. When we support a simple thing like property taxes funding schools, it results in huge inequity. A 5-year-old child of color isn't going to get the same education that those of us who live in good neighborhoods. That's racist. So property taxes funding education is racist. And the book argues that you're either racist or you're anti-racist. There's no such thing as I don't discriminate. And I think it's a good book to read. I do think we need to do fundamental things. And most of them really are policy things, because policy causes racism to happen. If you don't have vote by mail, it is racist because certain classes of people have much harder time accessing voting. If you have the right property tax structure that rich neighborhoods can't fund their schools better, we're going to be anti-racist. So policy is where we can most impact racism. It takes longer. There's also, of course, a strong human bias towards people of our own clan. And that's pretty racist. And we have embedded racism in everything. When you look at inherent bias, there's a book I read about 5 years ago called Whistling Vivaldi. I'd highly recommend people look at it and say, how does racism creep into all of our actions? So we do need radical awakening in people, and hence protests by Black Lives Matter are very valuable in awakening us to what happens. Anyway, let me stop there.
That's very good. How is Silicon Valley doing in that area, would you say? There was another question about Silicon Valley's performance and belief in what you just outlined.
So in Silicon Valley, there's no problem for Asians. Asians do a fairly large percentage, in fact, generally have higher incomes than the white male population. So I don't think there's racism against Asians, whether you're Indian or Chinese or Japanese. The Indian per capita income in the US is twice the national average, as is just even a little bit higher than Japanese ethnicity in the US. But people of color, Latinx, and other people of color, Black people, they are not as much a part of Silicon Valley for sure. You know, gender equality is doing better, not where we need it to be, but doing better. But clearly, people of color are excluded in the Valley, and they're partly excluded because, as I said, education systems for people of color are much worse than for regular people. They don't go on to good universities and engineering schools. They don't have the same access. So we need to do more than just be neutral, be color neutral. We need to be proactive about fixing the problem. We need to go much further through mentorship, through various programs to go address this. But long term, it's the policy issues that cause racism, and our biases cause inherent biases, unconscious biases cause racism.
Insightful. I mean, the good news is we've seen some movement lately. Both SoftBank and Apple have announced $100 million funds to invest in Black and minority-owned technology startups. So we hope that's the beginning of a lot more action here. We'd switch gears just a little bit. I know
but
you started with healthcare.
Let me take one level lower. There's reports that something like 40% of all Black-owned businesses are in danger of going under. 40%. This is your corner store. It's a real disservice when that magnitude of disruption happens, that they're disproportionately affected by COVID and the protests. Like, that's a hard problem. And we are doing things about it, you know, but we need to do far more, and for far more communities.
Indeed, indeed, and I appreciate your perspective on it, and you're engaging here. To switch in our last couple of minutes here back to investing. I know you were really big advocate of clean tech investing, and I wanted to get your view on kind of where we are now in that landscape. Are there any interesting founders in energy landscape or companies that you're evaluating in this current time, given what happened in the kind of the mid 2000s with clean tech 1.0?
So first, clean tech was hard, probably 10 years ago. It went through resurgence in 2006 to 2010, and then had a crisis in funding. But let me suggest the good companies did well. It was a hard area, but Tesla is a great example of great returns. QuantumScape is a very promising multi-billion-dollar valuation company, well-funded to build solid-state batteries. That was in our portfolio then. It took a long time to mature, but it is a multi-billion-dollar company. LanzaTech just raised $90 million just to do jet fuel, because jet fuel is not amenable to electrification. Viewglass, last 2 years ago, raised $750 million. These are large numbers valued at something like $3 billion. So there clearly have been successes. They don't get written about, but they have been successes. And even out of the 2008, 2012 portfolio, there are many, many unicorns in there. There's, of course, new ones coming up. Impossible Foods is my best example. We did it for sustainability in 2010 or 2011. Most recently valued at $4 billion. It has $1 billion in the bank. A lot of money in the bank, and doing extremely well with an 80% reduction or 90% reduction in carbon emissions and water use. We don't think of it as a sustainability play, but it was made as a sustainability play because it does so much for the climate and animal cruelty, and it really produces a product not for vegetarians, but for non-vegetarians to enjoy. So it is alive and well with many, many large examples of successful companies. They don't get written about. They don't get hyped like Uber and Lyft. The press has moved on, but the real work goes on. I mentioned Commonwealth Fusion, where we are working in fusion. We have a solar company. We have a cement company called Calera that's doing well. With carbon reduced cement. We have many other things that reduce the carbon footprint on the planet. So I don't think it's gone away. I just think the attention for it has gone away. Funding has declined, but the good companies are still doing fine. And I find renewed interest in the area.
Yeah, we're seeing the same. So I invest in the energy sector, and there is definitely a resurgence happening. All right, so we're down to our last couple of minutes. Vinod, I thought I'd leave this open for you to just end with some closing remarks, thoughts, encouragements for the audience, maybe even a little perspective on kind of democracy and the state of the economy as we're coming out of this pandemic, since we started on that topic. Love to hear your view.
Well, here's what I would say to all of your audience. The pandemic has surfaced some things. It has made things harder for some, but it has opened up a whole set of new opportunities. Obviously, health services are doing extremely well. Uber and DoorDash and Instacart doing extremely well. So there are opportunity areas. Interestingly, manufacturing will get a huge boost the next 10 years. We don't think about it. As we invert the supply chain with robotics and local manufacturing, I think it'll be one of the largest long-term opportunities created by the pandemic and the US-China tensions. So remote work, of course, is talked about a lot. Entertainment, esports. So there's many, many areas that have opened up. Here's what I would say to your audience more broadly. I'm 65 today. When I turned 60, I started looking at, hey, I know a lot of people retiring. If I'm going to work on creating startups and helping create startups for 25 years, what should I work on? I wrote a 50-page document for myself called Reinventing Societal Infrastructure with Technology. And I asked myself the sustainability question. 700 million people, 10% of the world's population has a rich lifestyle. Rich in energy, rich in housing, rich in medical care, rich in education. They can go to universities, rich in entertainment. 7 billion people on the planet want it. And we can't have 10 times the amount of steel, cement, doctors. We can't have 10x of everything to afford everybody the right lifestyle. The only solution, not a sufficient solution because we need other things to happen, but a necessary piece is technology multiplication of resources. And only technology multiplies resources, turns one doctor into the equivalent of 10 doctors assisted by AI, for example. So what I found doing the research was there was no part of non-governmental US GDP that couldn't be innovated by hundreds of percent to achieve this goal of 7 billion people wanting the lifestyle of the best, richest 700 million people. And those are all entrepreneurial opportunities for this audience. So if anybody is interested in whatever area it is, whether it's food like Impossible, whether it's construction like 3D printed houses, we are just looking at investing in a public transit startup, public transit. No area is immune from innovation and entrepreneurship. And there's huge both societal impact to be had and huge entrepreneurial opportunities to do well while doing well for others. That's what entrepreneurs thrive on. And 10 years ago, I would have said VC and technology entrepreneurship is about technology efforts. Internet, mobile, consumer, shopping, e-commerce, enterprise software. It wasn't about most of American business. It wasn't about cars. It wasn't about transportation. It wasn't about construction. Now, everything's open to this audience, so there's many more opportunities. And I couldn't find an area that wasn't open to radical technology-based innovation. So that's my message, takeaway message to everybody. So dream the dreams. It's a lot more fun living life that way, even if you fail periodically.
Great way to end the conversation. Thank you so much, Vinod. What a pleasure today. We appreciate your insights.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.